Hello and welcome to America Latina Story. By the end of the 17th century, Scotland was in a tricky situation. After several years of successive famines, like so many other European nations, its economy was in dire straits, and it was in danger of being absorbed by its rich southern neighbour, the Kingdom of England. Some scheme was urgently needed to save the country both politically and economically. It was then that emerged in the mind of William Paterson, a wealthy Scot trader and financier, and one of the founders of the Bank of England, a brilliant idea dubbed the Darien Scheme, which foreshadowed the Panama Canal by 2 centuries. This idea came in great part from Patterson's acquaintance, Lionel Wafer, a surgeon and buccaneer who had been cared for in Darien during 4 months by Kuna Indians and who had described the place to Patterson as a land of milk and honey with friendly natives. The idea was to found a Scottish colony at the very east of the Isthmus of Panama, in the region of Darien, a territory already claimed by Spain as part of Nueva Granada. The commercial purpose of that colony was to provide a regular service of transportation for goods between the two oceans, thus facilitating the trade between Europe and Asia. Such service would shorten the journey by more than half and be safer and cheaper than the Cape Horn route. In Patterson's words, Darien will be the door of the seas, the key of the universe. It all seemed rosy and easy. However, the future colony was to be implanted in the midst of Spanish settlements, peopled by enemies. And Darien was an extremely unhealthy place for Europeans, described as a country that devoureth men and eateth up its inhabitants. Indeed, if Darien is a beautiful land from above, then and now it is a lethal place with billions of mosquitoes, many of them carrying deadly diseases. The Spaniards already occupied a less unhealthy part of the isthmus to the west, and they had already put this idea into practice by transferring from one ocean to the other via El Camino Real de Portobello and El Camino de Cruces the gold and silver they extracted from Peru. That was enough for them, and they had no desire to lure third parties into an international goods transit operation. The isthmus was also regularly used to go from one ocean to the other during the 17th century by pirates and privateers such as Ravenau de Luçon and Oex Melun, who crossed it in the area of Darien to attack Spanish vessels in the Pacific before returning to the Atlantic via the southern coast of present-day Guatemala and the Rio de Segovia. But this commuting could hardly be called a commercial venture. In order to finance the establishment of the colony, Patterson founded in 1695 the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. Unable to obtain institutional funding from England, as the English were not keen to help a potential rival to their own East India Company, Patterson went public. He managed to quickly raise, in the form of shares, £400,000, the equivalent of $55 million in today's money, coming mostly from the life savings of many ordinary Scots who believed the project was without risk. It is thus that 5 ships forming a first contingent, the Caledonia, the Dolphin, the Endeavour, the St. Andrew and the Unicorn sailed from Scotland on the 4th of July 1698 with 1,200 future colonists on board. A second contingent of colonists was due to depart from Scotland a few months later. 4 clergymen accompanied the 2 successive waves of settlers. They were part of the deal obtained by the Church of Scotland for its moral support in the affair. This is far from anecdotal, for one of them, the Reverend Francis Borland, wrote a detailed account titled The History of Darien, that is one of the main sources of the history of the whole venture. To say that the expedition was ill-prepared and ill-managed is an understatement. The cargo transported by the ships consisted primarily of wigs, blankets, women gloves, combs, mirrors and the like, with hardly any weapons or tools, and not a single horse. Still, the fleet landed in a bay very difficult to access on the 2nd of November 1698. 70 men had died during the crossing. 2 months later, after a good deal of excruciating work, Fort St. Andrew and the capital New Edinburgh, a mere collection of huts, were erected. But the colony, which had been christened Caledonia, was unable to sustain itself. It had to rely on supplies from outside. But that was impossible, as the neighboring Spaniards were enemies, and the English colonies of the West Indies refused help and trade by order of their king William of Orange. By March 1699, the famine was endemic. 200 settlers had died, and 10 were dying every day of disease and hunger. Soon the colonists feared a Spanish attack that they would be unable to repel, and the colony was abandoned after 8 months on the 20th of June, before the second wave of settlers arrived. The return journey was pitiful. The Caledonia was the only vessel to make it back to Scotland in a sorry state, with 300 persons on board. 2 minor expeditions reached the colony in August and September of the same year, but finding the place deserted, they soon left. The second major expedition departed from the west of Scotland in August 1699 and reached the colony on November the 30th. More than 1,200 colonists had been distributed aboard 4 vessels. The flagship of the small fleet, the Rising Sun, the Duke of Hamilton, the Hope of Boroughstoness, and the Hope. Sadly, 160 passengers had died during the 4 months' crossing. This second wave of settlers fared no better than the first one. They had been promised a new start in life in a land of plenty, and they encountered the burned ruins of an abandoned settlement in an unhealthy environment. The very reasons that precipitated the failure of the first expedition produced the same effect, and soon the new settlers were busy burying the dead. Furthermore, the Spaniards had at last reacted to this foreign presence on their territory and were on the march to attack the colony. The Scots tried to stop the advancing forces and won a victory in a skirmish at Tubacanti, but to no avail. Soon the 1,000 men of Don Juan Pimienta started to blockade the famished colony, which capitulated on the 31st of March 1700. The negotiations of the capitulation were conducted in French and its text written in Latin. The Spaniards gave generous terms to the Scots, and the fleet of colonists set sail for the last time on the 12th of April. This second contingent had stayed in Caledonia just over 4 months. The return voyage was as dramatic as that of the first expedition. 250 persons died during the 1 month crossing to Jamaica, and, as a symbol of the whole enterprise, the rising sun sank with all hands during a storm in front of Charleston Harbor in Carolina. In his book, The History of Darien, the Reverend Francis Borland suggests several causes for the failure of the colony. The implantation of the colony in the very midst of enemy territory, a sickly and unwholesome climate, the impossibility for the colony to sustain itself, the lust for personal gain and not the common good amongst the settlers, the ever-changing government and organization of the colony without a central power, the location of the colony on the shore of a dangerous bay and half-mile from fresh water, the behavior of the English who systematically impaired the enterprise, and the difficulty to get supplies from Scotland. But foremost in the Reverend's mind was the human material. Our land has spewed out its scum. We could not prevail their wickedness restrained, nor the growth of it stopped. This bunch of immoral and profane men did not even possess the beginning of Christian sentiment, and in that venture they justly received the deserved wrath of God. We may add to that list the suspicion of a curse resulting from the looting of a French wreck in nearby waters, and, much more seriously, the sheer incompetence and lack of management skills at all stages of the project of those in charge. The entire expedition had been a complete disaster with a death rate of 75%. Patterson had paid a high price, losing his wife and only child in Darien. It was a blow to Scottish morale and economy. Scotland was bankrupt as a nation, and many a Scot had lost their life's savings. Scotland was now ripe to be acquired by England. This happened in the form of an indemnity of £398, known as the equivalent, or more pejoratively, the price of Scotland. The political union of the two nations was ratified by the Act of Union in 1707. Scotland had failed in its only attempt at colonizing, but it was destined to provide the soldiers needed by England for the expansion of its empire. Thank you for watching this program. Do not hesitate to subscribe to the channel. This is all for now. Goodbye.